Hello and welcome to World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, China rules out recognizing the DPRK or North Korea as a nuclear power after Pyongyang's Friday missile test in the face of tougher UN sanctions. What will it take to launch a dialogue instead of tests? China, South Korea, and Japan band together to set the record straight in a history textbook. Will this finally put to rest the issues over war atrocities in classrooms? We begin from the Korean peninsula, where the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea, last Friday fired another ballistic missile over Japan. This comes just days after the United Nations imposed the tougher sanctions on Pyongyang. The test was reported to be the DPRK's longest ever flight of an intermediate ballistic missile. Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Choi Tian-kai, said over the weekend that China would never recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state. So what's next?
A sixth nuclear test and its longest ever missile flight. That was the DPRK's response to the new UN sanctions. Experts say the flight duration indicates it could reach the U.S. territory of Guam. U.S. President Donald Trump stood in front of an American bomber to deliver a message.
We will defend our people, our nations, and our civilization from all who dare to threaten our way of life. This includes the regime of North Korea, which has once again shown its utter contempt for its neighbors and for the entire world community.
This is also the second DPRK missile that passed over Japan in recent weeks. The Japanese Prime Minister said it was time for the international community to act in unison.
It has become clear that the latest sanctions need to be imposed in full. North Korea needs to understand that if it continues on this path, there is no bright future.
China has insisted that both the DPRK and the U.S. must make concessions to ease tensions. China's ambassador to the U.S., Choi Tian-kai, said that a first step by the U.S. would be an end to threats against the DPRK. The ambassador also stated that China would never recognize the DPRK as a nuclear state.
I don't think nuclear weapons will bring security to DPRK or South Korea or anybody else. It could only make things much worse. I hope people will have a clear understanding of the seriousness of the issue. We are certainly opposed to the existence of nuclear weapons anywhere on the Korean peninsula, anywhere.
The DPRK is defiant in the face of the latest UN sanctions, saying its leader Kim Jong-un vowed to complete the country's nuclear weapons program. This week, the leaders of South Korea, the U.S., and Japan will hold a summit on the DPRK on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York. The international community is on the lookout on what kind of agreements could be reached in this summit and how jitters over the peninsula could be eased.
So how can the DPRK, the North Korea, and the U.S. dial back tensions? Is it ever possible? Let's loop in our panel to find out. In Beijing studio, we have Mr. Da Wei, Assistant President of the University of International Relations here in China. Welcome, sir. In Washington, we are joined by Jonathan Pollack, a Senior Fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. We're also hoping a South Korean origin professor would also join us later in our discussion. But first of all, let me go to you, Mr. Da, here in Beijing. How should we understand the words coming from the Chinese ambassador, Mr. Choi Tian-kai, to the United States? He said over the weekend, China will not recognize DPRK, North Korea, as a nuclear state. But you know, Mr. Da, that DPRK has nuclear capabilities. What does that mean?
I think when Ambassador Choi Tian-kai talk about that, I think he talked in a legal perspective. I think, yes, it's true that DPRK now has some kind of nuclear capability, but legally it will never be admitted as a nuclear state because their nuclear program is illegal and it's banned by the UN resolution, and the country violated the NPT regime. So no country will
NPT
recognize.
regime meaning non-proliferation treaty, of course.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so no country, I think, will recognize the nuclear state. Only the 5 nuclear power which had nuclear capability, nuclear weapon before the NPT treaty was signed, are the legal nuclear states. So we need to distinguish the two things. One is legally a nuclear state. The other is a country has a nuclear capability, nuclear weapon. Yes, North Korea, DPRK may have some nuclear capability, but legally it will never be recognized as a nuclear state.
Got your point. Very important point over there, because a lot of people do not understand what exactly China meant when Ambassador Cui said so, but with the interpretation there, very crucial. And let me go to you, Mr. Polak. The UN ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Ms. Henley said, United States has exhausted all diplomatic means when it comes to the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. How should we understand that?
I'm not quite sure what she meant. There seems to be a lack of recognition that the new sanctions that have been imposed are very, very new. No one, I think, expects overnight results. The consensus of all the members of the Security Council was that North Korea had to pay a bigger price, and it is paying a bigger price for its continued nuclear and missile testing. So I don't know whether she's saying that in a way just to stir people up. But I think she needs to be very careful about the words that she uses. The implication is, if we've exhausted it, then what's the point? But I think there really is a very definite point, and I think most of the time I would like to think that she accepts that. That's certainly the premise of U.S. policy, as I understand it.
I see. Another thing which many people do not understand is the president of South Korea said also over the weekend that South Korea do not see any possibility for now about dialogue anymore with North Korea. Tougher sanctions to come. Mr. Da, you've been a seasoned observer of the latest situation. How do you interpret that?
I think what President Moon meant was that, currently, at current phase, negotiation or talk is not a good choice because the UN Security Council just passed a new resolution, and the international community just decided to press North Korea harsher, So we need to wait and see if this kind of, resolution can change DPRK's calculation. And now currently, at current phase, I think the priority is sanction, is pressure. But I don't think President Moon excluded negotiation or dialogue in future. I think if DPRK made some concession, if DPRK decided to stop nuclear and missile tests and stop provocation, I think in the long run, even in the mid-run, I think the negotiation is still something desirable, particularly for South Korea.
And of course, at this point, we are also joined by Professor Sun-Young Lee, who is a Kim Koo Korea Foundation Professor of Korean Studies at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. He's joining us also from the United States at this point. Professor, welcome to our program. Professor Lee, we also have noticed there has been an interesting quote coming from the, of course, attention-exhausting Twitter of President Trump recently. He talked about his Twitter diplomacy, particularly shouting to his North Korean counterpart. He said this: "Ask Kim how Rocket Man is doing. Long gas lines forming in North Korea. Too bad." That's just a quote coming from his personal tweet. Of course, we are not here to give an official interpretation as to what exactly this U.S. president meant in his personal tweet, but how should we understand the focus of Washington now when it comes to what to deal with and how to deal with North Korea? Is it about the fuel now? Or is it about dialogue now? Is it about the military action now? Or is it about just shouting now? Professor.
Well, as an academic, I must first take issue with President Trump's failure to give proper attribution to that phrase, Rocket Man, which the British journal The Economist on its front page, back in 2006, carried a photo of Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and called him Rocket Man, in reference to North Korea's 7 rocket salute, including a long-range missile test on America's birthday, July 4th, 2006. Now, I want to say that all this is highly coordinated, the messages, the hawkish message coming from the U.S. ambassador to the UN and the Defense Secretary and President Trump. But I'm somewhat skeptical that this is a very highly well-coordinated strategy of ambiguity, sending a stern message to North Korea and perhaps even to China and Russia on the eve of a major meetings among the heads of state at the UN General Assembly this week. We know North Korea provokes not only on a major holiday, but also North Korea likes in on its neighbors' parade, South Korea and Chinese. Earlier this year, North Korea.
We have some connecting problems now with Professor for now, but let's go to, I did understand your point, sir, though, over there in the Tufts University. Let's go to you with Mr. Polak in Washington, D.C. You know, one of the things that people really need to understand is what exactly is the focus of attention in Washington as to what is going to be the actions and reactions toward North Korea for now. Of course, Professor Lee talked about the General Assembly speech President Trump is going to give on Tuesday, first ever as president. But there are a lot of media focus, Mr. Polak, about the fuel issue in
yes, there
North
is
Korea.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's curious that there are times when the U.S. policy process seems to concentrate on this issue and have a degree of direction, but then I must say often on the Sunday news shows many things are expressed by senior U.S. officials, perhaps in part for domestic consumption. Certainly President Trump's incessant tweeting, and in the case that you just talked about, it's not so much a tweet, it's a taunt. It's almost the kind of thing that we would expect from North Korea rather than from the President of the United States. And very frankly, I just don't see what useful purpose it serves. The United States wants everyone to be serious about this issue, and that has to begin with the United States itself and with the U.S. leadership. So we continue to hear, to a certain extent, very different opinions and judgments, which, very frankly, I don't see, to say the least, as a very, very encouraging sign. There really needs to be coherence and message discipline that we just don't see yet.
Mr. Polak, I have to ask you more about that, because there are several news reports recently with New York Times as well talking about the fuel issue with the DPRK. As you may know, the recent sanctions is about cutting further fuel exports to DPRK by China and some of the other countries as well. So there has been a lot of history about whether the United States has been functioning or not functioning at all to cut off the possibility for DPRK to develop ICBM and nuclear weapons. There is specific thing about the UDMH, that's a specific fuel that would propel the kind of engine that would help to launch the ICBM that North Korea has. And according to the New York Times article, asking for senior officials served both in the Bush Jr. administration and Obama administration, they didn't recall any specific measure were taken in order to cut off that possibility to North Korea.
Well, this, of course, is a report in today's New York Times, which I have read. I'm aware that there's been some speculation about this fuel. I personally do not think it is beyond the realm of possibility that North Korea could have its own indigenous capability to produce it. Very frankly, I think that the report was a bit exaggerated. It is true we see evidence of North Korea using different kinds of fuels in some of its missile tests, but in this case, yet again, the speculation is somehow this is getting into North Korea rather than North Korea being able to do it itself. So how pivotal it is, it's hard to say. It's clearly a very volatile kind of fuel. It may give them some enhanced capacity, but we don't always want to accept uncritically what we read in the New York Times.
Right. Okay. Well, having said that, though, it's important to talk about the focus of the attention now in Washington. The DPRK has said something Washington usually argued back, and this time it's also about the capability. The DPRK said Saturday it sought equilibrium with military force, the U.S., and the DPRK seemed to be perfecting its nuclear weapon delivery system with all these tests. However, the DPRK lacks two parts of the nuclear triad to genuinely reach the United States. Although the DPRK boasts land-based ICBM that are par with U.S. Minuteman, so-called ICBMs, the U.S. boasts the nuclear Trident missiles fired from submarines, while DPRK's nuclear submarines are still in the testing phase. The U.S. also boasts the air-based nukes delivered by B-2 stealth bombers, while the DPRK hasn't tested any strategic bombers yet. There seems to be a competition going on, at least in that list. But having said that, though, Professor Lee, I hope we could talk to you now. What do you make of the next step? Are we going to see further sanctions, particularly after Tuesday, President Trump delivers his speech at the General Assembly for the very first time?
Yes, there will be an effort to enforce sanctions, both U.S. sanctions and an effort to try to get the world on board, all UN member states, to do their part to enforce sanctions, and that's the right approach. Diplomatic options and other forms of rhetorical bellicosity is not helpful because we are not at that stage of having to resort to military force, which really is the very last resort. You know, there's a cliche in our field of international relations, diplomacy does not take no for an answer. So for top diplomats to say there's nothing more we can do, it reflects more the frustration on the part of the administration rather than a sound policy intention. I think that would paint the U.S. as that's motivated more by aggressive behavior than North Korea. So it's very unhelpful. And most importantly, I don't think North Korea is deterred by that kind of bluster. I think North Korea is very crafty in climbing up the ladder of escalation, and with the next provocation, which could come this week when the world leaders are gathered at the UN in New York, if North Korea an ICBM test, that certainly won't lead to military retaliation by the United States because the world will not see that as cause for war.
I see. Well, Mr. Da, you've been listening to your two colleagues over there, but here's the thing. There has been another drill being tested by both the United States, Japan, and South Korea today, with some stealth fighters flying from the air base in Guam, which is supposed to be the place where North Korea claimed to attack if offended. So are we, meaning China, going to accept any kinds of military actions undertake toward North Korea as North Korea's neighbor? And meanwhile, how is China going to be able to protect its own security, both from its north neighbor, which now has nuclear capability, and then also from the others in the names of attacking North Korea?
Of course, China, I don't think China will accept or China want to see any military conflict or even war on Korean Peninsula. As you said, China is a neighboring country. So this kind of military conflict could cause, serious consequence to China. But having said that, there is a possibility of military conflict or even a war on Korean Peninsula, and also I think there is a possibility that North Korea, DPRK's nuclear facility, their capability may have some kind of problem. For example, the leaks, that could pollute the the neighboring area in northeast China. So I think on the one hand, China need to be ready to prevent this kind of pollution, this kind of potential pollution from DPRK. On the other side, I think China need to prepare for military conflict between DPRK and other countries, and also I think also it's a time for China and other countries to talk quietly on the crisis management and and also the if something happened, what all the related country can do together to prevent the worst scenario. So I think these are the things that China needs to think about and needs to do.
Needs to think about, but at the same time, Mr. Da, could you help us to understand this? Because on the one hand, China wants the dialogue and the conversation with DPRK, for example, and the United States going on. But at the same time, China needs to prepare for the worst scenarios. If the one is being paid attention to, for example, the worst scenarios, what China could do, and in talk with some of the other countries, will that be taken advantage by some of the other countries, suggesting, well, China already, in a way, giving a nod, a possibility for military actions toward the North Korea by us, and therefore, let's just go.
Yeah, I think this is a long-time Chinese concern for this kind of dialogue with, to be frank, with the United States. We don't want to send a wrong signal to other countries. But I think, now it's already, because the situation is so dangerous, I think through dialogue, during the, when we have dialogue with other countries, we can make it very clear. This is not a signal. This is not a green light for the military action on Korean Peninsula. I think this is the only way that we can work it out.
Mr. Polak, you have a lot of information about the Korean Peninsula issue. Help us to understand, how should we understand these different layers of things going on, so-called exhaustion of the diplomatic means by the United States, claimed by the ambassador to the United Nations, of course. And then there are also suggestions of dialogues going on at a certain level with the North and also the United States. While at the same time, people and parties are preparing for the worst scenario. How should we understand the different layers from your perspective? Very briefly, sir.
I think that there's some informal or not fully official dialogue, so-called Track 1.5 activities, where North Korean diplomats may be present and where there may be U.S. diplomats as observers. My impression is that these have not been at all satisfactory if people see some possibility for some kind of a meaningful breakthrough. I think that the fundamental reality right now is that North Korea continues to push its advantage, and that it is not, at least for the present, showing any signs of responsiveness to the outside world. Quite the contrary. There's almost seems to be a desperate search to enhance its capabilities. We can ask why that is so, and maybe speculate a bit about that. But I think under the circumstances, the most important thing, and I think Dawei has just highlighted that, is for a candid, frank, private conversation between all the involved countries, and I would put the U.S. and China very, very high on that list. The media may speculate endlessly about what is going on there or not, but I have enough confidence that both governments, if they were to meet in that context to discuss these possibilities, would be very careful about their words.
Right.
I hope very frank about their concerns and possible actions, and on that basis we might have some measure of, I don't want to call it stabilization, but at least risk management if things were to go from bad to much worse.
I see. Well, on Tuesday, U.S. President Donald Trump is going to give his first ever speech at the General Assembly of the United Nations, and also coming later in the week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is going to give a speech as well on the General Assembly. I'm sure there will be a lot of things going on. Meanwhile, the Chinese and the American president have agreed that they are going to meet each other during President Trump's later visit to China later in the year. Hopefully, these will be occasions for things to work out for the better. Thank you so much for the three of you for being with us. Dawei, Jonathan Polak, and also Sun Yong Lee. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. You're watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program, China, South Korea, and Japan look to guardians of history to set the record straight on war atrocities in textbooks. We will talk to our panelists about educating the young on proper history right after this break. You're watching World Insight with Tianwei, coming to you live Monday to Friday on CGTN. A joint editorial committee of scholars from China, Japan, and South Korea is writing a new history textbook to resist the Japanese right-wing force efforts to whitewash atrocities during the Second World War. The committee has published 2 books so far: The Contemporary and Modern History of 3 East Asian Countries in 2005 and A Modern History of East Asia Beyond the Boundaries in 2012. Work on a 3rd book has also begun and is expected to be completed by the year 2020. Although disputes between 3 countries do arise over the history, a consensus has been reached earlier that a correct perception of history is the foundation for reconciliation in Northeast Asia. So how can scholars from China and South Korea, as Japan as well, really write a history textbook that suits them all? We're looking our panel. With us here in Beijing, we have Professor Xiong Li, who is an associate professor at the University of International Business and Economics, joining us here. Welcome to our program. Also in Tokyo, Japan, we have Professor Takasato Watanabe, who's a professor emeritus at Doshisha University. I want to welcome the 2 of you, gentlemen, for being with us. Professor Watanabe, I want to go to you first. How convincing, academically, do you think this committee with scholars coming from 3 countries come up with history books that are accepted by 3 sides?
Japanese scholars, most of them are very sensitive to this issue. However, the real scholar who is searching for the truth, they recognize and admit clearly the invasion of Japanese troops, Japanese military side, to Korea and also China. However, the Japanese central government, led by Mr. Abe himself, he is, you see, not admitting even the Nanjing massacre. He is saying that there's no definition of invasion, so that we should not talk about invasion to China like that. This is wrong. One of the scholars who is writing the book you refer to is my colleague of our university. He said that we should learn what really happened in the past. In case of Europe, German people and German government admitted their failure. There, you see, mischiefs to the people of other European countries. So they have the common knowledge of the activities of military side of Europe. In Japan, Japanese government does not want to recognize it. This is the problem.
All right. It is not, let's just say, a single case in which your professorial colleague suggested that. There are also many other voices coming from the Japanese society. For example, former Japanese history teacher Tamaki Matsuoka, who has been very widely reported, believes that textbooks have become a stumbling block for the relations among the countries in Northeast Asia. She's worrying young people are in danger of resorting to the internet to know more about history, and they may believe the nationalist view that Japan did nothing wrong during the Second World War, which of course is not the history itself. Having said that, though, Professor Xiong here in Beijing, we all understand politics would have a big impact on the current version of history being taught and being learned in any country. So given where Japan is politically right now, how confident are you that this joint committee with scholars trying to come up with the same version of history so that the students would have a better knowledge of history will be able to do their work?
Frankly speaking, I'm still not sure how this joint editorial committee can do in Japan. How can they to influence the historical views of the Japanese people? In fact, the public opinion in a society may be most important. But in recent years, because of political influence, the public opinion in Japan has been more and more obscure on historical views. That means more and more people, especially the young people, know little about the history, what happened in the past 100 years among Japan, Korea, and China. And this is something dangerous, in fact. So, indeed, the government in Japan may do more on this. That means maybe at first, the politicians may have more views, have more voice, have more right voice on historical issues.
But you know that is not happening given what Professor Watanabe just explained. The administration in Japan right now is leading the public to believe otherwise rather than you're talking about the version of history. And that is exactly the problem. The question is, under these political circumstances, can you have academics and textbook be able to spread around and spread the message? Professor?
In fact, that means if we would like to achieve this goal by the efforts of the Joint Editorial Committee among the three countries, at first, from the politicians to civilians, the Japanese should know more about how to find a solution to the so-called historic issue. And indeed, apologies by the Japanese is just methods to find solution. And the ultimate goal of the solution to the historical issue should be reconciliation. But without apologies, without learning more about historical truths, how can we get real reconciliation among the three countries? So, to achieve reconciliation, we should know more about historical truths.
I guess that is exactly the issue. Professor Watanabe, let me come back to you. I mean, it is not rare phenomenon that academics are saying one thing while politicians are advocating the other thing. And of course, usually the academics are having much weaker voice than the politicians, which usually have megaphones to help. So how convinced are you that do you think these kinds of textbooks will be helpful for set the record straight for the Japanese young people? Meanwhile, not only the central level, but also at the local level, as you may know, there are also very different political views about history at different kinds of localities in Japan. Sometimes a governor will be able to make the decision about what kind of textbooks to be used in Japanese schools. So are you confident really that this kind of committee would really help to better the understanding of the Japanese youth about the war and the history?
In the Japanese system of the education textbooks, they must be admitted to use by the Ministry of Education. And there are not a single, but about 5, 6, 7 textbooks which are recognized by the Ministry of Education. Then the local government's educational committee must decide one of them which is used in their own local community schools. So it is so difficult for them to find a good one or the best one or correct one from those 6 or 7 textbooks which are recognized by the central government of Japan of the education department. This is the first, you see, the problem. Second problem is that most of the politicians you have referred to already of the Conservative Party, LDP, led by Mr. Abe, they don't admit even the Nanjing massacre or comfort women of South Korea or North Koreans, you see. So they say they were the prostitutes, not the comfort women. So this kind of is a different, wrong idea of the concept of the comfort women or Nanjing massacres. You see, these are the problems. So First, you see, from the citizen side, we must begin with the correct education of the history, which should be used as the subsidiary textbooks of the higher education of high schools and junior high schools, I think.
But then on the other hand, can we rely on textbooks, particularly in the political situation like in Japan, to tell the truth? Professor Xiong, here in China, I want to ask you about this because recently you see quite a number of documentaries, whether it's produced in South Korea or in Japan, talking about the so-called comfort women. In fact, they are sexual slaves during the Second World War II made by the Japanese invaders at the time. And they were trying to tell real personal account of the story. And these kind of messages spread around in theaters around the world. Made me wonder, Mr. Xiong, with this desperation in Japan, not likely to face the history in textbooks, can these kind of messages spread around to achieve the goal, to help the youth know better exactly what happened in history? Professor Xiong.
When we mention the historical issue, especially for the Japanese people, it seems that always means the Japanese people, the Japanese government should make some compensation to the neighboring countries, such as China and Korea and other neighboring countries, which have ever been invaded by the Japanese troops during the war period. But if we think more about this, we should know the historical issues such as the comfort women, it's not just means Japan's loss and gain of the Chinese or the Koreans. It may be helpful for the Japanese society, for the Japanese people. Indeed, besides reconciliation with neighboring countries, another benefit for the Japanese society may be to learn more about historical truths and learn more lessons from history, and then can help the Japanese people to prevent replay of such historical tragedy, such as comfort women. So from this perspective, we can see the historical issue is not just Japan's loss. It can also be the gain of Japan, the gain of all the involved countries. Right. So from this perspective, historical issue should not be a burden of the Japanese society, should be a lesson for the Japanese society, should be a treasury for the Japanese society, to learn more about this treasury, and then can be helpful for a brighter future for all the countries.
We hope your words can be heard by those who are making the decisions about what kinds of history textbooks is being used in the Japanese school. We hope that will be the case, but that is not the case at this point. Professor Watanabe, and therefore, how should we go and where should we go from here? You know, people talk about, well, because the historians don't talk to one another. Now the historians do talk to one another. They even have a committee. They try to come up with textbooks, but yet those textbooks in some countries are not being widely used, not being recommended to the students. So how would the student ever know? So it seems politics plays such a big role in here. Can that be solved? Can you do it through other means?
Joint committee started about 13 years ago, and already, as you have pointed out, 2 textbooks on this issue, problems, were printed out, and if we can teach or learn things through this, we can buy very easily, but it is not so easy for the school teachers to use them as even the subsidiary textbooks. So, as you have pointed out, we, the scholars and citizens of the people who want to know the truth of the past, we must, strongly operate the campaigns to know the better and the truth of the past history for China, for Koreans, and for other countries too. This is at least the things that we must do.
You also see through our footage earlier that there has been commemorative activities going on September the 18th, which is exactly today. That is the time when China was conquered by, many big part of China was conquered by the Japanese invaders during the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. And it was during this time that China has decided it is going to fight back, and it's going to fight back in a big way with all of the other countries, and eventually Second World War changed the world. And we are talking about history, ladies and gentlemen, today, not because of about who exactly won that war, but because of that we all understand that part of history cannot be repeated in the future, and no war could help anyone at this point and in the future. So before we go, I do want to hear very briefly from both of you some advice for the politicians and some advice for your society. 15 seconds and one sentence or two from every one of you. Let's go to you, Professor Watanabe, first.
Politicians of Japan, they want to follow the social movement of the people. So we must educate the person who are living, you see, around us. So this is the thing that we must do.
I see. Influence whoever you can, particularly those around you. And Professor Xiongli Li here in Beijing, final words.
I would like to say two brief sentences. The first one, joint efforts for joint memory of the past, and joint memory of the past for joint prospect of the future.
Okay.
So that's for the joint prospect of the future among the three countries.
Thank you so much, Xiongli Li and Takasato Watanabe. Really appreciate it for being with us. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly visit our website. Just type World Insight CGTN in your search engine, and we will be able to find us, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and see the Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.